computer. Folks, we're looking forward to seeing you join us this lunchtime. We are just looking at the attendees clock counting away, and we've got a number of people that have been registered, and we'll make a formal start very soon. In fact, we'll do so right now, just as I get myself organised here. It's fantastic to have you with us, everyone. Kia ora tātou mai haere mai, ko Simon tauka wangua. I'm your Auckland North Community and Development host, the Training and Capability Lead for ANCAS. So welcome along to this Lunchtime LiiFT with special guest chat today. We're organising these sessions across the lunchtime period from around this time, 12 o'clock noon, in order to make the sessions accessible to as many people as possible. And being a webinar means you get to eat your lunch at the same time without us even seeing you do so. So that's a good sign. Today we have a Lunchtime LiiFT chat with special guest Ruth Greenaway from Tapestries, who is an oral historian and researcher, to discuss what a community social researcher does. And I know that you're also going to get a sneak peek into discovering ways to speak to the history and the legacy of your own group service too, which is really, really good. Before we begin, while listening to our conversation with Ruth, if you have any questions you may have on this topic, you can go ahead and write those in the Q&A section on the Zoom toolbar as we'll progress our chat. And look, we'll endeavour to get to those with a response toward the end of this lunchtime session. We will be recording this session, and it's being recorded now, and placing it on ANCAS YouTube channel after today. So I'll email everybody a link to this afterwards as well. And for those that couldn't participate today, I'm sure they'll be delighted to receive that as well. So for those who haven't or think they might have actually seen Ruth before, well, actually, Ruth was working at ANCAD a few years back in a similar role to what I'm doing at ANCAD today. So I can say I've learned from the best. So it's fantastic to have you along, Ruth. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Simon. It's good to be here. Thank you.
All right, well, look, we've got a set of questions I know, and before discussing the other day with you, it was fantastic to hear of some of the things that you're involved in. And just as we make a start, I've got a question here for you. What does the role of an oral historian entail, and how does it intersect with your work in community social research?
Thank you. First of all, just to kick this session off, can I, just before I answer that question, let you know that today is actually the anniversary of women's suffrage in Aotearoa, the 19th of September, women getting the vote in 1893. And for me, that's really where it started, because I studied New Zealand history at Victoria University in Wellington. And then I did my training with the National Oral History Association and back in the 90s. And so I've actually been an oral historian now for going on, next year will be the 25th year. So that's pretty exciting. And then alongside that, yes, I've also done social research, mostly qualitative research, which again involves interviewing people and hearing about their stories and their experiences, but with a focus around contemporary social issues. And I've done that work with councils, city councils, district councils, academia, and community organisations. And then, so alongside that, I've also always worked part-time in the community with not-for-profits, such as when I was with ANCAD. And out of all of that came the opportunity to do some oral history stories about people who've gone either through the services and their stories, so preserving those for the organisation, or also looking at the story of the organisation. So actually having that combination of social research skills as well as being an oral historian interviewer, and also having studied New Zealand history, is quite a good mix, I feel, because then it enables me to be able to look at the broader context, and to be able to look at what's happening today, but also be able to trace those threads back into what has been our social and political history in this country.
Excellent. Hey, you mentioned threads there, and congratulations too on the 25 years. You'll have to
Thank
treat
you.
yourself to quite a few cupcakes, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, look, you've called what you do around the word tapestry. So can you tell folks, how did you come up with that name? What's that all about?
Well, I actually last night I went on and Googled the lyrics because it came from a song. I've always been a big fan of Carole King, and she had an album called Tapestry and a song by that name. And so back in the 90s, when I was thinking of a name for myself and set myself up as a small business doing freelance research in oral history, um, my thinking was, first of all, that our stories connect us all, that that we learn from one another, and that our stories really create um, bringing forth the metaphor and the analogy, like the fabric of society and the fabric of our lives, and there's so much texture in our lives. And so I feel that our stories are woven together. And so that's why I like the idea of tapestry as symbolic, not just of a visual, tangible tapestry, but a metaphorical one for stories. And can I take this moment just to read the first verse of his song? Because
Yeah,
it really,
sure.
because I think it's just so beautiful. And that again is where the inspiration came from for me. So it goes like this. I won't sing it, I'll just read it. My life has been a tapestry of rich and royal hue, an everlasting vision of an ever-changing view, a wondrous woven magic in bits of gold and blue, a tapestry to feel and see, impossible to hold.
It's wonderful, isn't it? Yeah, it's
Yeah,
inspirational, isn't it?
yeah.
Yeah.
And there's so much in there, like woven magic, being able to feel and see it, but it's actually impossible to hold. Like we never really know the full story of each other, but we get bits and pieces of it. And yeah, so that's
Yeah.
where it came from.
I love it. Fantastic. So, having quoted that and hearing in your voice, I can tell there's a passion there. So, I guess my question next is, where did your passion for the storytelling come from? Where did this sort of start?
Yeah. So my story. I think stories have always been a big part of my life, and I kind of only came to realize that once I got into doing oral history, like looking back on my life. And then it was an opportunity where I started just to pursue the interests that I had. And I recognized that there were a lot of stories and people who had been quite influential in my life growing up. Um, for example, part of my story is that I grew up in a Christian family. My father is an Anglican priest. And I always remember after, obviously going to church and him giving his sermons and that all being storytelling, going to Bible study and Sunday school and things like that. But then coming home and then asking dad questions about what was in his sermon, and him again divulging more stories and the history of the Jewish people, stories of Moses and all sorts of things. And and then that sort of led later into more teenage years when there was a lot of political stuff happening in New Zealand, and my father and my parents and their friends were quite involved, like the boycotting South Africa during the 70s, and then the anti-Springbok tour of 81, and then the peace movement, the nuclear free campaign, and the peace squadron of all the boats on the harbour protesting the arrival of the nuclear powered ships and things like that. And so then just again, like asking my dad, why are we boycotting South Africa? What is apartheid? What is racism? And then learning about racism in New Zealand and New Zealand's history and bit by bit. And when it came to doing oral history, I'd actually been traveling, and um, uh, while I was overseas, I'd been going to storytelling festivals, and I also have a theatre background in my own story as well. I'd done a lot of theatre from a really young age, and performed a lot of shows in my teenage years here in Auckland. Um, and and so while I was traveling, I was just, I don't know, it came to me just thinking about how parts of New Zealand's history hadn't been recorded, such as the work around the peace movement and the nuclear-free campaign. And in a way, that sort of was the beginnings of it for me, because one of the most significant projects I did in the early 2000s was with a branch of the Peace Foundation in Christchurch. And I got reacquainted with a family friend who knew me when I was really young. And she'd been involved in all of those campaigns. And so we got funding, and we ended up doing a project where we interviewed over 30 people in a year or a year and a bit, of their whole stories of their involvement, but not just of the nuclear free, but it sort of started post-war. Or it actually started with a man who was imprisoned during the Second World War for being a pacifist. And then it moved into opposing the Cold War and the build-up of the nuclear arms race in the 50s. And then right through to the 80s. So that was an amazing project. And out of that, there was a ripple effect of other things that came out of that, such as a documentary film, a few radio documentaries, and more talks and presentations and things like that. Yeah.
Fantastic, great. There were lots of opportunities that came along, and it sounds like it started, quite young, as you described, and asking lots of questions and being around your parents and maybe storytellers and capturing that same spirit of storytelling. So that's awesome. Leading on from that, I guess the key question for us here today is, why is it important for community groups, organisations, and others as well, to tell our story?
Well, as I mentioned before, I think, when you think metaphorically, the social fabric of society, the grassroots organisations, the NGOs and the not-for-profit groups, now we talk of them as for-purpose organisations, and in the community sector, for me, really make the fabric of our society from a social point of view. And in terms of like how we connect people, and how we look at our society in terms of our values, how we look at where need is, and talking about equality and equity and all of those sort of issues, and how we want to make the world a better place and thinking about social change. So if we don't know, number one, if we don't know our history of where people fought for change and then also have built on their work and now have left a legacy, then we're a bit, we can't keep, what's the point of doing the work if we don't know all those stories of where it came from? So that's why I like to do organizational stories. It's number one, I like to look at the founding story, where the vision was from people, why they saw a need, what was the social context, the social political context at the time, and so what were they sort of standing up for? What was the vision for change? What were the social values and things? And then now, the next, there's more generations that come in and continue to do that work, particularly if you're talking about an organisation that's been around for a few decades. And then those people then evaluate, is the need still the same? Do we need to shift and change what we're doing? And also, what is the change? What's the impact that we've had? So part of my work is to say, well, how do you look back at that impact and at that legacy, and then voice that back to your key stakeholders, back to your community, to the government, to the council, to funders, and say, look, we're really important. We've made it, we make such a difference. And not only us, but it's our partnerships and our linkages across the community that also are really important.
Exactly, and I can imagine there are so many associated stories to that main story, and describing the history as you have done, and just how people come and go from organisations and groups. We do well to record how things were at the beginning, and obviously how they develop over time, and we're all involved to a lesser or greater degree in terms of strategic planning, and keeping things like that in mind, and where we've come from, where we are now, where we're heading to. So one of the things, Ruth, you did when you were at ANCAD you produced a book. It's a really big book. You might even have one on your table. I'm not sure.
Yes, here we are. Let us show everybody.
Yeah, and this was called, as you can see, My Story, Your Story, Together Builds Communities. And turn it side on, Ruth, so people can see how thick it is. So it's a really thick book, complete with many, many stories. And I'll let folks into a secret here. We've got a workshop coming up in October. I'll tell folks about it at the end, where you can come as an in-person workshop to learn a bit more from Ruth. And every person that comes, I think, Ruth, will give away one of the books that you've just held up as part of the fee. So look, tell us a little bit about that. How did it sort of come about and to being published?
Well, first of all, let me just see if I can hold this up and show you a photo of the team who worked on the book. Look, can you see that?
Yeah, we can see that. Yeah, there's a few people. You might want to name some of them if you want.
So there was those of us who were part of the NCAD staff was Yvonne Cowley, who was the CEO at the time. She did that. She's also a photographer, and she did wonderful photography for this book. There was Susan, who was the office financial administrator person, and myself. And then also someone who we had freelance, who was our designer. She did the layout and design of this book. And then I brought in a colleague and friend of mine who's a historian, Megan Hutching. And then we had a local theatre person, community worker, and writer, Richard Howard, who also came on. How it started was that it was in 2014, NCAD was celebrating its 40th anniversary. And so we had a big celebratory AGM for that. And in the lead up to that, we had little bits and pieces about the history of NCAD, which had previously been North Shore Community and Social Services. And so I pulled that all together and created a sort of a Finnish publication, which you've got in the office, on the history of NCAD. And so that went up, because NCAD was founded in 1974. And so that went from 74 to 2014. And we presented that to the AGM, gave copies away. And then Yvonne and I thought to ourselves, well, we've celebrated our story. Why don't we do something for the members? Because NCAD is an incorporated society and we support all these organizations and have had 40 years of working with all these, 150 it was at the time, community organizations across the North Shore. And because it was North Shore Community and Social Services, it literally was just North Shore back in the day. When Auckland became the super city in 2010, NCAD soon after rebranded and had more focus on being a greater region and going Auckland North. But up until then, it really was, I'm here in Devonport, so it was from Devonport through to Albany. And as I say, about 150 organizations. Well, at first, and we wanted to celebrate some of the firsts that had happened, like the legacy and the heritage of the North Shore in terms of its community development. And we asked for names, and we started out with 10, 15, 20, 30, and it just kept growing and growing, and it ended up being 54 people. And I did all the interviews, which was amazing. With my little digital recorder, people came into the Mary Thomas Centre, or I went to their place of work or to their homes and sat with them and did about 2 to 3 hours worth of recording. So what we wanted to do was we wanted their own personal story, again, because it's about their motivation. Why were they inspired to get involved in community development? Or why did they see the need for the first community house, or the need to preserve the heritage and save the buildings such as the Pump House or the Lake House Arts Centre? Why did they get involved in setting up the Women's Refuge or the Women's Centre and things like that? Why were they interested in housing, homelessness, and all those issues, or arts and recreation? And so we've got the personal story, then we've got the kind of the social campaigns and the sort of movement around the bringing people together, setting up a trust, all those sort of early visionary people and what they hoped for against the backdrop of the social and political context of the time. So the stories start from the mid to late 60s and went up to 2014. Oh, it included environmentalism. There was forest and bird and lots of work that had been happening around on the shore with environmentalism. And then we asked people for personal archival photographs as well. So Yvonne would come and take a present day photo, and then we had these early photos of them. And so then when it came to writing up the story, it was like, I also did some archival research. ANCAD had some archives. We went to the library and looked at council archives and threaded all, and having said that, threaded all through the book is also a history of local government on the North Shore, because we looked at people, because that was the thing, some of the, whilst we're focusing on leadership, some of the people they crossed over between community, academia, and local government. And those who were in local government had been part of the borough council, the city councils, and then it became North Shore City Council, and then it became the Super City. So there was all that change. And it actually, one of the great things about this book was that those people involved in local government said it was the first time that such a documentation of the changes of local government like that had been recorded. And so back in the back of the book, we've got all these photographs of all the different councils. And then we had this amazing book launch. We had about 250 people come to the Takapuna Library, and there was a reunion of all these past mayors. And so we had this wonderful photograph of all these mayors. But yeah, there's a lot of people in here, people that are still around, like Jill Nerney, Dan O'Connor, Linda Blinko, and then obviously people who have also passed away. And so there were a few people that had actually already passed away, so I had to work with their spouses or friends and try to, some of them had written, and so was able to read some of their written work and draw on their own personal archives and things like that.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
What a lot of time and effort that went into. Well done, Ruth. And it's a fantastic record, and people hopefully will get to see that when they come along to the workshop. So do spread the word, folks. We'll tell you more about that a little bit later on. So that was about that book, Ruth. What about some examples of other projects where you've helped nonprofit and community groups tell their legacy stories? And what were some of the challenges and as well as the rewards of those projects?
Yeah. Well, as I say, I started in 1999. I actually started interviewing a few individuals before I got onto that Peace People project. I remember interviewing, it's quite funny, Alan Brash, who was Don Brash's father. He was a minister in the Presbyterian Church, and he was a founder of the World Council of Churches, and then also of Christian World Service, which is the Protestant churches aid agency. So it was interesting like that. So whilst he's talking about these organizations and things, I really only just did his story. So sometimes it would be just for an oral archive, like to have the audio for those organizations, and then they could choose to do something with it. But other times it was with a project in mind. After I did the Peace Project, I worked, I was actually living in Christchurch, and I worked at the Christchurch Environment Centre. And it was the first environment centre in New Zealand. And now there's like a hub network, they call them hubs now. Now there's a big network of environmental hubs across Aotearoa. But at the time, it was coming up to celebrating its 30th anniversary. And its first centre coordinator was Rod Donald, who became co-leader of the Green Party. And so I did a life history interview with him, plus also people who had volunteered, people who got involved in early environmental activism. And it was just an in-house publication, so the design is not that fancy, but it's the book.
Okay, yep, looks good.
Yeah. And it's we just had black and white photos on the inside. And but I mean, and that's well before, talking about climate change and stuff. That book sort of finished off on talking about genetic modification. But it's really fascinating just again to see what was important for people in terms of their awareness around the environment and what were the early campaigns. And then I've also actually worked with families too. So looking at legacy stories, like of stories of the older generation, and they want to pass that down to families. So I've got a couple of books here. This is for a family, and I'm building on the environmental theme. This was a book I did about this couple.
Wow.
They were building on the environmental theme. They were real early promoters of organics, and they started what was called, again, they were from Christchurch, and they started what was called the Compost Club in the 1950s. And the Compost Club turned into the Soil and Health Association.
Wow.
So yeah, so that was a great project to do for their family. And then this was for a family. It was a woman who was from Hungary, but she had lived through the Second World War, but then also 1956, the Hungarian Revolution, and that was a beautiful book with lots of lovely photos.
Wow.
And she had written her story on scraps of paper in Hungarian, and then her daughter, who I dealt with at the time, who by then was in her 80s, had translated it into English, but it was all bits and pieces, fragments. And so to pull it together and make some semblance of it and turn it into chapters and, a whole story. So that was really good. And then back to organizations. It was a year or two ago that this book was published. And I worked again with Megan Hutching on this, and this book, Threads of Caring, is a history of the Anglican Trust for Women and Children, and it's the book for ANCAD would be the second largest project. This has been the largest project because this took working on this for 5.5 years part-time.
Oh, wow.
And so this had 18 oral history interviews that I did. Plus, we went to the Anglican Archives, which is underneath the cathedral in the city in Parnell, and did a lot of archival research, and then a lot of online research again, just to look at New Zealand's history, and then also and because this is about welfare, and this is one of the first published books on a history of welfare from a community and a church agency perspective. There's been New Zealand historians have written about New Zealand state welfare. So I did a lot of reading about their work and state institutions and things, whereas this was focused on a church organisation who came together, had various trusts, but in the 70s amalgamated and became the Anglican Trust for Women and Children. But what was brilliant about that book was I learnt so much about early Auckland, because the organisation basically started in 1858.
It's amazing. You must have a fantastic repository of knowledge from asking these questions and doing the research and finding out. So I can see how it's not only rewarding for the people that receive these publications, but also for you, just in terms of what you're learning and how it impacts on other people and society around us. That's just awesome.
Well, it's really neat because having been fortunate to follow some of my own interests, but then also just been asked to do projects. I'm waiting on a book that's about to be published in October, which is with my first corporate company, like a multi-million-dollar construction company.
Wow.
And I would never have thought that I would write a history about construction and set it within a context of the construction industry within New Zealand.
Yeah.
But this was for a construction company called Foster's. It's based down in Hamilton, who are celebrating their 50th anniversary. But in actual fact, the story is longer than that, because it started off with a father and son after the Second World War. And again, I did about 18 interviews for that, and interviewing all these tradies and apprentices and learning. I'm on a huge learning curve because I'm learning all about the construction industry that I didn't really know anything about, and then having to get my head around it. Plus also boards of directors and company, looking up the company's register and all this sort of stuff.
That's right. Fantastic. Wow. Well, we're going to have you on our quiz team, all right, Ruth? Hey, so Ruth, another quick question then. Let's see if we can see how the impact of storytelling can affect things like funding, fundraising. So, in working with nonprofit organisations, what role would you see storytelling play in fundraising and building support for people's groups' causes?
Well, one thing that's important to sort of differentiate is actually storytelling and legacy storytelling. So there's the storytelling of the work that you do, the clients that you work with on a daily basis, and that's more kind of contemporary storytelling around what's happening now. So that's really important, obviously, for capturing your audience today to hear about the change that's actually happening today. But then there's also the legacy, which is looking at why did the organisation start in the first place? What was the vision? What was the theory of social change that those founders had? And why was there a need? And then, as I said before, is that need still relevant today? Are the services still relevant, or what's changed? And then looking historically at the impact that has happened. So you've got a bit of both there. And I think when you're thinking about legacy, that's really important for your key stakeholders, your relationships with your funders, with ministries, with government, councils, to say, look, we've been around for a long time. We know what we're talking about. We've stood in community for all these years, and we've seen what's happened, and we understand the social issues and the reason why things happen. So again, we're a voice for you, and if you partner with us, we can inform you, and we can build a relationship and inform policy and legislation and that sort of thing. And then the other side of it is in terms of building your for fundraising and building your audience, you want to keep up the storytelling. But it's also really quite good, like with this Anglican Trust for Women and Children. Again, that's built an audience of people who really want to know stories, and partly it's also the people who went through the system, who were the beneficiaries, who maybe lived in the homes, to actually have them acknowledged, and they come back and there's a pros and cons with that, because also there's been the Royal Commission on Abuse and Care, and the board for that organisation had to present at the commission. But fortunately, the timing was good, because we were doing all the research, and so we were able to inform the board on its own history. So if you are part of a board and you don't know your history, you only know what's happening now, you're not in a very good you're not in a very good standing place in terms of being able to speak to current issues, past issues.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see
I hope
how.
that answers the question.
Yeah, no, like it does. Yeah, I think we can definitely see how this brought together somehow and collated in some form or different forms will be of help in many different ways. We've got a question coming in. I'll save it to the end though. Good question. Look, a couple of questions maybe left to go, Ruth, and then we can open up for people to field that. You can field some questions from folks here today. What advice would you have for nonprofit organisations and community groups interested in preserving and sharing their own legacy stories? You mentioned a few things already. Do you want to say anything more about that?
Yeah, well, I think I'm always onto this in terms of keeping an archive. Keep the things that you're working on today as an archive for the future. But also, again, it's like generations of managers, CEOs, and board members come through. But I think it's really important to maintain the relationships with those people who have been part of your organisation in the past. Yeah. And that's what was really good about ANCAD. The founder, Joan Lardner, she founded North Shore Community and Social Services in 1974, and she was working with the Auckland Regional Authority. She founded a number of other organisations, and she continued to work right through until her 90s. And we maintained that relationship, and that's really critical, and she became a lifetime member of the organization, as did some other people in the book. In that way, you're honoring your ancestors, you're honoring the fact that you're building on their work, even though it may be different today. And again, I think if you can capture stories with people who've worked for your organization, stories of people who've passed through your organization who've been clients, even if it's like anonymized, just building up that wealth of information so that one day you can write a book, or you can do something creative on social media or on your website, or even helps with any presentations that you're going to give to your funders, or the stories if you're an organization that relies on having regular donors and donations, you've got something to continually feed through with your newsletters and things like that.
Yeah, for sure. And look, with the different things with technology nowadays and how to save and preserve things, it's getting better, and we can use those tools as well. Well, look, we're coming to the end. We will get some questions from people that are putting them into the Q&A box, so feel free to do that, folks, if you do have a question for Ruth. Let's see, how can people get in touch with you, Ruth, in terms of your tapestries, what you do?
I have a website, which is tapestries.co.nz. And then also my email address is story@tapestries.co.nz.
Right, fantastic. Right, I'll include those in the email that I can forward on to people, as well as this recording link as well. Awesome. Okay. And all right, well, let's talk a little bit about the workshop we've got coming up. So folks, it's called Telling Your Organization's Legacy Story. We've done an earlier one this year for about 2 hours, well attended. People went away feeling, oh my goodness, this is fantastic. And they wanted more. So we've now developed, Ruth is developing a 3-hour workshop. It's going to take place on the 25th of October. It's going to be in the morning, 9:30 through to 12:30 p.m. And we'll include some sort of food and light lunch or whatever it'll be, so you won't go hungry. And don't forget, we're bringing along those My Story, Your Story books as well to give you, to take away. So that's a great thing as well. We're going to have that up on our LiiFT website, the training website we have, which is LiiFT, LiiFT.nz, LiiFT.nz, probably in a few days, actually, Ruth, after this workshop. I'll put it up, we'll promote it out there. That's going to be held, folks, in Takapuna, so at the Mary Thomas Centre there, if you can make it at all, on the 25th of October. All right, well, let's head to before we do,
would you like me to describe?
Ruth, is there anything you want to talk about what's going to be in the workshop? Just give us a few hints.
Well, from the first workshop that we did, which was great, I realized that, because it was the first time I'd done it, so I realized that there was a wealth of information for people to take in. So this time around, I'm going to provide a few more examples that you can just take away and explore and read through in your own time. And what I realized too was, again, that differentiation between regular storytelling and focusing on telling a legacy story. So in terms of like defining ways to tell a legacy story, I'm going to talk about angles of legacy story, because there's leadership, there's social impact, there's heritage, social need, political change. There's all these different angles, and they may or may not be relevant to your organization, but they also those are kind of like the micro stories, the stories that came from the individuals who are really passionate about the work. So those are the types of things that you can focus on too when you're doing an interview with someone. And then at the macro level, there's the story of the organization as a whole, like everyone together. And within that, then you kind of look at it more in terms of layers. So we talked about having a theory of social change. What does that mean? What was the vision of the founders? Through to how do you measure your services impact? And so there are about 4 or 5 different layers, and I'm going to give some examples of how I've done that with organizations. And then one of the things that we actually ran out of time for in the previous workshop, and why we've extended this, is people really were keen to know, how do you do an interview with someone? And so I'm going to bring along my recorder, invite people to use their phones and do some peer work, where you actually interview someone and have a practice in terms of, it's sort of appreciative inquiry type deep listening, and thinking about, like, what are those layers, what are the things that you want to get out of the interview that are relevant to being able to tell the history of your organization. So we'll do a little bit of that. So there'll be some theory and some practical and some notes and information that you can take away.
It's going to be fantastic. Awesome. Hey, so Ruth, with that in mind, we've given away the dates and things. And look, and people, if you wanted to come and bring some of your team or some of your board along, people have found that to be really, really useful, and you can sort of talk together, and the responsibility is not just on the one person, but yeah,
absolutely.
So feel free to bring others with you from your group. All right, well, we've got a few minutes, about 5 minutes to go. Ruth, it's been absolutely awesome. Thank you so much. There's so much to tell, I know, but we'll get more in the workshop, which is good. I'll just head into the Q&A part. We've got a first question here. Do you have a favourite key question or questions for legacy storytelling? This person is thinking of their 30-year-old youth-based charitable trust.
A key question.
Favourite sort of key question for legacy storytelling.
If you're interviewing people who started the organisation, a key thing to ask is really why. Why was there a need? What was happening at the time? What were you responding to? Were you angry about something that wasn't being provided for young people? You know, was there a personal story, something that happened for you in your family or with young people? Was there a lack of something and you thought to yourself, my gosh, I can do something about this? You know, kind of getting those early motivational type stories. Then another key question too would be around what difference have you seen happen? Again, it's a bit harder if an organization is fairly new, but if it's like 10 years or more, you can then think about, well, what I've seen, like in a youth group, we've had young people come through from when they were at primary school. Now they're, 18, and when we bump into each other, they go, oh wow, you really changed my life, you really had such a positive impact on my life, I wouldn't be where I am without your service, that type of thing.
That's right.
So those are two really key questions.
That's right. And then one question leads into another question as well, and then you get the response. All right, the second question of 3 we've got, this person sort of asking a bit around budgets. They ask what kind of ballpark budgets to create a book publication, because there's obviously a lot of research and interviews and publication costs. I think there'll be differences between, depending on the time involved. But anything you want to say around budgets?
Yeah, it's tricky. First of all, you've got to actually think what is the scope of the project before you get into the budget. So like this one, it had a 160-year history. So the scope was huge. We thought about who were the key people to interview. Then we recognized that there was background, contextual research and archival research. And then that led into, because you have to work everything backwards, that then led into, how much time is that going to take? So we were only doing it part-time. Initially, I quoted a year to do research and stuff, just for the research part of it. The research, I think, turned into 2 years, and then the writing turned into another writing plus editing and reviews and getting people's feedback turned into another 3 years. Then the design and working with a publisher and stuff turned into another 6 to 9 months, and then there was the printing.
Yes, that's right.
So again, it's also dependent on who you're working with. If you've got people inside your organization, you can offset some of that cost, because if it's built into their time, then that's all good. If you're bringing in a freelancer, like myself, we would give you an hourly rate and quote like how many hours it would take, you know, an estimate to do such and such. Then there's costs around whether you're needing to travel through the country to go and interview people, or to go to archival collections. There's lots of things to consider. So that's why the scoping exercise is really important, to figure out what are the steps, who you're going to, and what's going to be involved. And are you working with people in your organizations, or you're contracting people out, and then put a budget around it. But typically, I say it takes me at least 18 months to do an organizational history, at least if I was doing that full time.
Right.
And that's just the writing and the research. And then of course the printing is a whole other, printing, layout and design is a whole other thing, because often the organization will go off and find people and get quotes for that. And whether you're printing onshore or offshore, the NCAD book was printed offshore, was printed in Hong Kong. And that was partly because, not so much because it was cheaper, but because they kind of had a good process, but you had to do a minimum of 500. Whereas whereas the Anglican book and this other one with the construction company, we found printers where you can do, normally a minimum would be around 200 copies, but then it's possible to keep going back and getting more done, because they're here in New Zealand and you don't have to pay for freight, and you don't have to deal with different time zones and things like that.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks. Good answer, Ruth. That's good. There's a lot to think about, as you said. All right, well, look, we'll finish on one question. Here it is. And the person asks about the tips of the best place to archive things. Is it, I guess, both online as well as physically?
Yeah. Oral history interviews. Number one, if you're doing something that's Auckland focused, there is the Auckland Libraries Research Centre, and they're always really keen to build, because they have an oral history collection that is focused on stories of Auckland. They're always keen to have a copy. I would keep a digital archive in your organisation. Then maybe it might be a university, or it might be another library or a museum where you want to have another copy. Always have backups of copies. And always make sure that you've written up a consent form with the people that you interview as well. And the National Oral History Association has a lot of ethical guidelines and standards around how to do interviews and how to think about ethical questions and confidentiality and privacy.
Great. All right, well, that's fantastic. And folks are just going to have to come along to the workshop and listen to some more information about how to do it. So look, Ruth, thank you so much for your time and telling us all about that. It's been great, very inspirational. And folks, for joining, thank you for attending today. We trust you've been informed and inspired. I'm sure you have. I'll email everybody the link to the recording of the conversation afterwards, as well as a short feedback form. If you wouldn't mind filling that in for us, would be great. For all of the other topics and training that LiiFT puts together, head to that liift.nz website, and I'll put that legacy workshop up in the next few days as well. So that concludes this Lunchtime LiiFT session today. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. I'll go ahead and end the session for all. Kia kaha. Thank you, Ruth. E nohura, everyone. Bye for now.